Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving headfirst into a topic that's been generating a lot of buzz lately, especially if you're involved in the world of defense procurement.
Yeah, the Forged Act.
Yeah, exactly, the Forged Act. Now, this is a pretty hefty piece of potential legislation packed with all sorts of recommendations, and today we're going to zero in on one specific section, Section 311, which focuses on commercial transactions.
Right, we're going deep on this one, trying to figure out what it all means, how it might shake things up, and what you might need to start thinking about to prepare.
So for those who may not be familiar with all the ins and outs, can you give us a quick rundown of what Section 311 is really all about?
At its core, it's pushing the Department of Defense, the DoD, to streamline its buying practices.
Streamline meaning?
Meaning making it look more like how businesses operate in the commercial world.
Ah, okay. So less red tape, more efficiency.
Exactly. Less red tape, more efficiency.
Got it. Now, I know there are a few key elements within Section 311 that have been getting a lot of attention. What are some of the big things that really stand out?
Well, the one that's probably making the biggest splash is this potential for a huge increase in the use of the government purchase card. We're talking about limits possibly going up to $25 million in some cases.
Whoa, $25 million. That's a pretty significant jump from where things are now, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It is. It would allow them to use the purchase card for a way wider range of purchases than they can currently.
So what's the thinking behind that? Why is such a dramatic increase?
It all comes back to that idea of streamlining. The goal is to speed things up, reduce some of that administrative burden, and make it easier for the DoD to work with companies who are used to doing business in a more, well, commercial way.
Okay, so that's the purchase card piece. What else is in there that we should be paying attention to?
Well, alongside the purchase card expansion, there are also proposed limitations on certain types of contracts, particularly what they call flexibly priced contracts. And they're also looking at restricting advance payments, capping them at 15%.
And again, I assume this is all in the spirit of aligning more closely with commercial practices.
Right. The idea is that by setting those kinds of limits, you're pushing everyone to operate in a more standardized way, which theoretically should lead to greater efficiency.
Okay, makes sense. Now, before we get too deep into the weeds, I think it's important to point out that when we talk about things like mitigations and measures of success in this document, these are suggested approaches. And the same goes for the alternative approaches. Those are just potential alternatives that were considered. This isn't a done deal. It's more like a roadmap of what they're aiming for.
Right, a roadmap or a set of recommendations. It'll be interesting to see how this all actually plays out.
Absolutely. So let's take a step back for a minute and look at the bigger picture. You mentioned aligning with commercial practices, but this isn't exactly a brand new concept, is it? The DoD has been trying to do this for a while, haven't they?
Oh yeah, this push towards commercial alignment has been going on for decades, really. If you go back to 1994, there was the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, which was an early attempt to simplify things and bring in some of those commercial practices.
Right. I remember that one. And I seem to recall that the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, has weighed in on this over the years as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, they've issued a number of reports, and if you go to their website, al.gov, you can find them all there. They've been pretty critical of how slowly the DoD has been to adopt these commercial approaches.
So what have been some of their main critiques? What have they been pointing out as problems?
Well, they've highlighted how relying on things like traditional cost-based contracts and very specific payment rules can actually make it tougher for the DoD to work effectively with commercial companies. It can lead to delays, can lead to increased costs, which is exactly what they're trying to avoid with this Section 311.
It's like they're stuck in their old ways and it's just not keeping up with the times.
Right, exactly. And you can even see this in the evolution of something like the government purchase card itself. That was introduced back in the 80s, but it really expanded in the late 90s.
And originally it was meant for more like small, simpler purchases, right?
Yeah, exactly. But over time, as commercial practices became more prevalent, the push to use it for larger purchases grew stronger.
And it seems like this Section 311 is basically the next chapter in this whole push to modernize how the DoD buys things.
I think that's a good way to put it. It's like the culmination of years of trying to make their acquisition process more efficient and more aligned with the way the rest of the world does business.
Okay, so now let's get into what this all means for our listeners, especially those who are actually working in defense procurement or dealing with the DoD on a regular basis. This isn't just theoretical. This could have a very real impact on how they do their jobs.
Absolutely.
So, what are some of the potential ripple effects that we might start seeing if these recommendations in Section 311 actually get implemented?
Well, one of the biggest changes, as we've already talked about, is that potential increase in the purchase card limit, up to $25 million.
Right.
And that's a massive jump from the current limits.
So if you're a contracting officer or a procurement specialist, you're going to need to be prepared to handle a lot more high-value transactions through the purchase card system. That's going to require some adjustments in how you approach things, right?
Yeah, definitely. You're going to need to understand the new regulations, the new procedures. You might need to get some additional training.
And what about from the vendor side? If you're a company that does business with the DoD, how might this impact you?
Well, for one thing, you might start seeing a lot more purchase card transactions coming your way,
Okay.
especially if you're dealing with larger purchases. And that means you'll need to be set up to accept those kinds of payments.
Makes sense. And then there's the whole shift away from certain types of contracts, those flexibly priced contracts, for instance. What's the thinking there?
Well, the rationale is that those types of contracts can sometimes create a lot of administrative overhead. They can be complex, they can be time-consuming to manage. And the idea is that by limiting their use, the DoD can reduce that administrative burden and speed up the process.
Okay. But couldn't that also potentially limit their flexibility in certain situations? What if they need a contract that can adjust to changing circumstances?
Yeah, that's definitely a valid concern. And the document does acknowledge that. They're suggesting that exceptions to those contract restrictions should be allowed in certain cases, but those exceptions would have to be properly justified.
So it's not an absolute ban, but it does raise the bar for using those types of contracts.
Right. And then there's the whole issue of advance payments. Capping them at 15%, that's a pretty big change from what some vendors might be used to.
Yeah, especially for smaller businesses or those working on really cutting-edge technologies, that could be a real challenge.
Absolutely. It could impact their cash flow, their ability to get projects off the ground. And that's why they're proposing some mitigations to help address those concerns.
Like what kind of mitigations are they talking about?
Well, one idea is to offer phased payments to vendors who might need more financial support upfront.
So instead of one big lump sum, they'd get payments at different stages of the project. This makes sense. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the potential downsides. I mean, anytime you make big changes like this, there's always the possibility of unintended consequences, right?
Right.
What are some of the potential negative impacts that people are raising concerns about?
Well, one that comes up a lot is oversight. With those purchase card limits going way up, there's a concern that it could be easier for things to slip through the cracks.
More opportunity for misuse, maybe?
Yeah, potentially. And remember, we're talking about taxpayer dollars here, so even a small percentage of misuse could add up to a significant amount of money.
That's a good point. So how are they proposing to mitigate that risk?
Well, they're suggesting more rigorous audits of purchase card use and also maintaining spending limits based on an individual's warrant authority.
So you can't just go out and buy a tank with your purchase card. There are still some checks and balances in place.
Right, exactly. And then there's the concern that restricting those flexibly priced contracts might limit the DoD's options when they're dealing with really complex or unique requirements.
Like, what if they're trying to develop some kind of super secret weapon or something? A standard commercial contract might not cut it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why they're suggesting allowing exceptions to those restrictions, but only when it can be clearly demonstrated that a flexible approach is absolutely necessary.
Okay, so there's some built-in flexibility there. What about the impact on the DoD's internal processes? Things like budget tracking, financial management. If things are moving faster, are their systems even equipped to keep up?
That's a great question, and it's something that they definitely need to consider. With more transactions happening through purchase cards and those transactions happening faster, there's a real possibility that their existing systems could get overwhelmed.
It's like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And that's why they're suggesting that they need to invest in upgrading those systems, making sure they can handle the increased volume and the speed of those transactions.
So real-time visibility into where the money's going is going to be crucial. Now, one final concern that I've heard raised is that with all this emphasis on commercial practices, there's a risk that the unique needs of the defense sector might get overlooked.
Yeah, like things related to national security or very specialized equipment. Those are things that might not always fit neatly into a standard commercial model.
So how do they ensure that those critical needs aren't sacrificed in the name of efficiency?
They're recommending operational reviews to make sure that all of these commercially focused transactions are still aligned with the core mission of the DoD. So they're not just looking at the bottom line, they're also making sure that they're not compromising national security or any of those essential defense-specific needs.
Okay, so it sounds like they're trying to be very thoughtful about how they implement these changes. It's not just a blind rush towards commercialization, it's more about finding that balance between efficiency and effectiveness.
Exactly. And that's going to be the key to making this successful.
So let's talk about success for a minute. How will we even know if this is working? What are the metrics, the benchmarks that we should be looking at to assess whether Section 311 is actually achieving its goals?
Well, the document actually outlines some specific measures of success that they're aiming for. First and foremost, they want to see a significant improvement in transaction speed. They're targeting at least a 20% reduction in the time it takes to complete a transaction.
So things should be moving a lot faster.
Yeah. And they also want to see a big increase in the use of the government purchase card for eligible transactions. They're aiming for a 30% growth in usage.
Okay, so more transactions happening through the purchase card system. And what about cost savings? I mean, that's a big driver behind all of this, right?
Absolutely. And they're specifically looking for cost savings of at least 10% as a result of these changes.
So faster transactions, more purchase card use, and lower costs. Those are the key things to watch.
Right. If they can achieve those goals, then you could argue that Section 311 is a success.
Now, before we wrap up, I'm curious, were there any other approaches that they considered, any alternative ways to address this issue of modernizing DoD transactions?
Yeah, there were a couple other ideas that they explored. One was a more gradual increase in the purchase card limits.
So instead of jumping straight to 25 million, maybe phasing it in over time.
Right, maybe starting with some pilot programs to test the waters. And the other alternative was to focus on enhancing the existing Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR.
Okay, so tweaking the rules rather than making such a sweeping change.
Yeah, exactly. But ultimately, they decided to go with this more aggressive approach.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. Any final thoughts for our listeners as they try to digest all of this?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is that this Section 311 represents a pretty fundamental shift in how the DoD approaches transactions.
It's a big deal.
It is. They're really pushing for a more commercially aligned approach, and that has the potential to change the game for everyone involved.
Absolutely. And as these changes start to roll out, it's going to be critical for everyone to pay close attention to how things are working, to monitor those measures of success, and to be prepared to adapt to this new environment.
I agree. This is going to be an interesting journey, and we'll be here to help you navigate it every step of the way.
So for those of you listening in, keep those questions coming. We'll be back next time for another deep dive into the Forged Act, exploring a different section and its potential implications. See you then.